Hi, welcome to the May 5th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, where we talk about best practices and experiences for running all forms of Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure, including the vSphere hypervisor. The agenda for today's meeting so far is kind of light, but we're going to talk about upcoming events at KubeCon Europe, which is about a week away, maybe a week and a few extra days, depending on whether you count the co-located events as part of the official program or not. Then we're going to move on to talking about a proposal that's coming from a few people on the Kubernetes steering committee about changing the way user groups operate underneath the Kubernetes project. At this stage, these are just proposals, but I just wanted to make sure people are aware that this is going on and you're entitled to an opinion and to influence how this comes about. So I'm very much interested in people's thoughts on this. You can give them directly to the CNCF and steering committee of Kubernetes, but I'd be happy to pass things along too. And then in anticipation of the talk that this group will be giving at KubeCon Europe, I just wanted to try to drop in a little bit and discuss zones in Kubernetes, which is a feature that, among other things, can be used to achieve high availability. And the reason I'm talking about it now instead of during the session itself is the session is only allotted 35 minutes. So we don't want to spend a lot of time just covering zones with very little to cover the specifics. And I thought maybe by dropping a little bit of discussion about that here in this meeting, we can kind of lay some groundwork that would be useful to people. So with that said, the first item is at KubeCon Europe, there is a session I'm doing with Michael Gash on optimizing the experience of using Kubernetes on vSphere by using event-driven automation. And Michael is going to cover this free open-sourced VEBA appliance. What this does is already a lot of the VMware infrastructure emits events that can be monitored through APIs. And this appliance goes and captures these things and publishes them in the form of something called cloud events. This is just, and I guess if you're really new to this, events can be notifications that something happened, or they can be data. The expectation, if they're data, is that they're small amounts of data, but they inform you that something's happened or here is the state of something. And cloud events is a CNCF specification that attempts to publish these in a standard way and through that standardization, making it easier to write apps that would consume these. So, if they come at you in 25 different forms, it can be very tough to write the code behind that compared to if they were standardized. So the CNCF backs cloud events. And then there is an open source project that is very popular and growing in popularity called Knative that is in a position to consume these events. And by the way, it can also emit events, but for purposes of this, the consumption side is probably more interesting. So Knative can consume these events, act on them or forward them, manipulate them into new events, etc. And Michael is going to demo a way to monitor things, configuration changes, maybe health changes of vSphere infrastructure, and react to it up at the Kubernetes level, because Kubernetes has in place a system to utilize these zones, but they're based on, it was originally designed for the major public clouds that already implement pretty opinionated forms of availability zones. With vSphere, one of the issues you've got going on is that it is very unopinionated. It's up to you, the user, to define what constitutes an availability zone in your specific data center or whatever location you have this in. So perhaps, in a moderate sized implementation, a zone a zone could be defined as a rack. Maybe in a bigger installation, it could be to correlate to an aisle. And the goal of defining these zones is you try to declare that this constitutes a zone because I think that it has very few or no common points of failure between one zone and the next zone. Now, the other thing you have going on in vSphere infrastructure in terms of flexibility is there is actually no demand. Your compute resource could have a collection of common or uncommon points of failure, and your storage could also have the same thing going on, as well as your networking. And it might be convenient to align those one-to-one, but the vSphere platform doesn't force you to do that. And there might be some reasons why you don't have that going on, either economic constraints or something else. And what Michael is going to cover is monitoring this kind of things, because they can go in day one in one state and something happens, either, a failure of a hardware device, somebody goes and changes a configuration that change what's going on at the infrastructure level. And you'd like to have this recognizable up at the Kubernetes level so that the scheduler does the right thing. So anyway, that's coverage of that topic at KubeCon. Number two is a few people are proposing that we have for the people who are there in person, that we have a physical meeting, probably over dinner if the size isn't too enormous. And Michael Gash proposed that be Friday evening, simply because it won't conflict with other events going on at KubeCon. They have the standard receptions and things going on, but Friday would be the last day of the conference. And his thought was that most people probably stay that extra evening rather than fly back right away, but I don't want to leave anybody out. So if somebody does have to return before Friday evening, we'll entertain putting that at some other day and time. So thoughts on that? I think before the official start of this, Kyle said that he doesn't think he can make it, but David, I think you'll be there. And Scott, I think you'll be there, right?
Yeah, I will be there. I know I can't do Friday night for religious reasons. I won't be near there. Yeah. So
you want to suggest another day then? I'm completely flexible, so I'm open to anything. And we don't necessarily have to decide it right here in this meeting, but if you want to get back to me through a DM with a list or something, because I sure would like to, we haven't had the opportunity yet to meet in person. And I think Michael wanted to do that too. So Friday was just a suggestion, not a requirement.
Yeah, I'm free basically any night. I can work around, whatever schedules and all that. I don't have any night plans yet.
Okay.
But yeah, so we can figure something out. But Friday's the only night I can't do.
Okay, I think maybe what I'll do is I'll compose some kind of document or spreadsheet of a list of attendees, and we can mark. We'll use that to solidify a specific time and date and place, and also allow people to specify, their preferences or requirements if we turn it into a dinner of, help us choose where that might be.
Awesome.
Anybody else got any topics related to KubeCon? If so, chime in now. I know, David, you've got a speaking session at the Rejects event, which technically isn't KubeCon, but kind of related.
Yeah, I'll be there giving a talk. It's I think at 10:20 or 10:30ish on Saturday. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll be there early.
Okay, let's move on then. So there's a proposal to change the way user groups operate under the Kubernetes project. And of course, this is a user group. As it turns out, a couple years ago, when they put in place a mechanism to start user groups, a number of different cloud providers stated a goal of having a user group, but they never actually started one. So it turns out that we are the only user group operating under the Kubernetes project, although at the top level, they thought more would materialize. Some people on the steering committee are making the observation that perhaps these user groups could be structured better, and that perhaps the scope should be broader than just Kubernetes alone, which in fact, the way we've been operating, I would contend it is. You know, we're talking about all kinds of things like load balancers. You know, Knative is going to be in this upcoming session. And the proposal is that perhaps the user group would be better to be placed under the CNCF. You know, that's a different repo on GitHub. They technically have a different organization and broaden the scope. And they're also wondering if breaking it down by the cloud provider you're running on is perhaps the best way to have attempted to split this, just because vSphere appears to be the only one that actually formed a group. You know, that during the meeting where they came up with this a few years ago, I think IBM thought that they would host a user group for IBM Cloud, and AWS thought they would. And I think in some cases, they actually started the PR to form it, but never followed through and completed it. So the group never went into operation. And one of the things on the table was to perhaps, you know, compose user groups by use cases. Like, you know, if somebody is a user and is predominantly engaged in machine learning, maybe there should be a machine learning user group. And this is just a proposal, but I think there will be some discussion of this going forward as to, you know, how they would go about this. Another thing that has come up is even that, you know, this is a user group that's essentially worldwide in scope, but the Kubernetes project had, before COVID bit in, a lot of regional groups operating as meetup groups, you know, under meetup.com. And I think from my observation, at least in the region of the world I live in, those have died off. But they would like to start operating user groups at even local levels, because the thought is that, I know in Los Angeles, I would go to that Kubernetes user group. And a lot of this is even the social interaction, just like going physically to a KubeCon and physically meeting people builds a little more camaraderie. That opportunity to have these regional groups where people are meeting face to face is desirable. And they don't really have a good structure to do that, because once again, they had these Kubernetes meetup groups, but in reality, that CNCF landscape has expanded to the point where nobody really uses Kubernetes in isolation. That what you're going to end up talking about on a practical level is the whole gamut of things, from the Kubernetes orchestrator to, I don't know, load balancers, disaster recovery tools, the whole gamut of things where you might find projects hosted under the CNCF repo. So I don't know, I've talked this out, but does anybody else have any thoughts on this? And what I'm saying is I'm trying to let you know this is going on, so that if later in the year there's some announcement that this got refactored, it's not some huge surprise. And I want to let you know what's going on, just because really the people who should have the most input on this are not people who are vendors. It should be the actual users, because that's who these groups are meant to serve.
Yeah, I think that having it under the CNCF umbrella would make more sense than having it under the Kubernetes umbrella, actually. I think it makes a lot of sense to have it under the CNCF because it just broadens the scope, as you were saying, and I think that the scope needs to be broadened. I do think that there still needs to be some, whether it's not vendor specific and you call it on-premise user group, or you call it air-gapped user group, or you call it vSphere user group, or you call it whatever the actual breakdown is of that. There are, in the end, the differences between Google and Azure and AWS are much smaller than the differences between vSphere on-premise and any of those. Because all cloud providers in the end have a built-in load balancer. All cloud providers have availability zones and regions. All cloud providers have an API for the storage that you use, and things are very, let's say, standardized in that world up there. Down here in the data center, it's a bit different. Now, that doesn't mean I think it would make sense. There's Nutanix, there's VMware, there's 100 different on-premise solutions, and having an on-prem user group, let's say, could be very interesting, right? Having it kind of be targeted at that.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, there used to actually be an on-prem group in Kubernetes, and the organizer changed jobs and the meetings kind of ceased. I mean, there's work involved with doing these, but I used to really enjoy those meetings. They were done by somebody who worked for CoreOS. But I think you're onto something there. Really, if there are those big differences in Kubernetes across the cloud providers and the public clouds, Kubernetes screwed up, because the whole premise of it is that it abstracted those differences out. But yeah, when you manage your own, that's a different beast. And I kind of like opening up a little bit broader than just, one vendor's platform. Frankly, under the old cloud provider breakdown, it didn't leave a seat for a user group for somebody like Red Hat, for example, who isn't actually a provider, even though they have a distro, and they were kind of homeless. But I know that the Red Hat people have even showed up in this group's meetings, and they've contributed a lot. And by having a broader tent, I think that we can have more contributions. I know that I've been in the IT industry long enough too, that there are other models for user groups, going back to the old Unix user groups, and in VMware, they have the vMugs and things. And one of the goals is always that you want users to actually try to manage it. But for many users, it's tough for them to justify to their employer spending the hours it takes to recruit speakers and actually manage meetings and go to conferences and put on presentations and things. So, in the perfect world, everything would be for users by users. But in reality, vendors are in a position where, they'll contribute to somebody's salary for doing the work that is behind conducting actual meetings. And you even see that with those meetup groups on a local level, where ultimately, if you have a meeting space, somebody's got to pay for that space, maybe bring some pizzas in and that sort of thing. And it's generally going to be the vendors that have an economic incentive to do that. So one of the arts of doing this is to provide a forum where vendors can justify that it's worth their time to keep this thing going without turning it into just a wall-to-wall sales pitch, which, nobody really wants. The users don't want it. If it's a sales pitch, you can't trust the things that are getting presented, because you need somebody to keep them honest.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think that, also, if it was an on-premise one, people that are using Nutanix could learn a lot from the people that have the experience on vSphere, and the people on vSphere could learn a lot from the people running on Nutanix or that are running on, you know, whatever other Hyper-V or whatever anyone is running on, because in the end, it's the same challenges.
Right. And I have to say, even working for a vendor, which I do, you really, as a business model, should keep tabs on everybody out there, because you don't want to be oblivious to somebody coming up with a new idea and, you know, your own implementation doesn't even have it. So I actually am in favor of having these cross vendor boundaries, because I need to keep educated on this anyway. So
yes, I think that it does make sense to break it up, not by cloud provider, but on, let's say, I wouldn't say to split it up to necessarily, yes, machine learning is an entire world in of itself that has implications at the entire stack, right? So a machine learning one would make sense, right? But there are things that, like, okay, load balancing user group, I don't think makes sense, right? Or a storage user group doesn't make sense. But an on-prem does make sense. An edge computing one does make sense. A public cloud one does make sense. And you can have something that affects the entire stack is, I think, kind of the breakup of one type of user group as well as regional ones. And I think it makes sense to have both, because having the global ones, I think, is great. They're more focus oriented, right? Which is awesome, and they can be done on Zoom. The regional ones are great for being, I would say, broader, just a CNCF user group of Israel, of Los Angeles, of whatever it is. And that's just a way to meet people in the ecosystem. That great, there will be one meetup that you won't go to because it's on machine learning and you aren't interested, but the next meetup of that user group is going to be on Kubernetes availability zones and you are interested.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sort of the locals would be wide open in scope, probably. And really, having managed a local group, you need to, because you're trying to get speakers in on all topics. And a lot of the reason I would contend people come to those local groups is not only to share experiences, but frankly, a lot of people use them for job leads and things like that too, or to go the other direction for recruiting. So yeah, I think we've already come up with some good ideas. I'll try to pass them along, but I'd encourage anybody here in the conversation to pass them along directly. I think some of the people involved with this will be at KubeCon. So it's the Kubernetes steering as well as the CNCF management. But I am going to proactively pass some of these ideas along, and we'll see what happens. I think the time frame for this is nothing's going to happen in the next month or two, but maybe something will have happened by KubeCon North America. If it doesn't look like it's going to happen, I'm tempted to actually put in a CFP for KubeCon North America to have a birds of a feather discussion on how user groups should be organized and see how that goes.
Is there any working doc or issue or proposal or anything on this currently, or is it just like person-to-person conversation right now?
I think it's person-to-person, but you brought up the idea of edge. So there is something that I was involved with, and it technically wasn't a user group. It was called the Kubernetes IoT Edge Working Group. And when it was originally formed, people thought that the reason it became a working group rather than a user group was that people thought that this group would discuss changes to the Kubernetes code base itself to accommodate edge. In reality, what ended up happening was that some projects spun off, like KubeEdge, which were really, some of them literally are certifiable Kubernetes distributions with add-ons, and it went a different direction. Yet this working group continued to hold meetings, and the reality of those meetings they were effectively edge user group meetings, but they weren't called that. And PR did get open to discuss that group leaving the Kubernetes project. And it's looking very much like that will land over in the CNCF repo and still continuing to operate there. And it was the same sort of thing, that Kubernetes at Edge brings in a bunch of collateral projects that some of them are Kubernetes, like variants of Kubernetes custom built for Edge, but also collateral projects that would be used alongside Kubernetes at Edge. So that one does have published docs, but this proposal related to the VMware user group does not. It's what it was a few of the people on steering just verbally approached me saying, you know, we've been having thoughts that maybe there's a better way to do this. And that's all that exists right now.
By the way, the multi-tenancy working group is a user group for every purpose of the name. It's a user group as well around multi-tenancy that there have been spin-off projects for, like
even though they
namespace
call it a working group instead, you mean?
Because they can't be a user group technically under the rules of what a user group is defined as in Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Right, but they have spin-offs of, you know, projects that came out, cluster API nested or virtual cluster or hierarchical namespaces, but like they're projects that broke off from there, and it's just meetings of people come in, and Nirmana came in and talked about Kyverno, and other people came in and talked about other products and came right.
Yeah, that isn't the only one by any means. I would contend that at one time a huge portion of the working groups were actually user groups, but maybe steering was unaware of it because they didn't drop in on the meetings. So they used to have a machine learning group that was labeled a working group, and I would contend was a user group. And it's the same thing where the organizer, they change jobs or whatever, and nobody is in a position to keep an agenda going, and that one just died off because they just kept canceling meeting after meeting, and there was no content. And then ultimately, when that happens, they declare that it, you know, the body is no longer has a beating heart, so let's just kill it. And I think there was one called Big Data that was in that category too, of being a de facto user group, but couldn't sustain itself. But anyway, the broader issue is maybe these are best hosted over at the CNCF, and it's not going to surprise me if that happens, but no immediate change in the short term. I just want people aware, you know, if somebody verbally says to me, hey, we're thinking about this, I'm going to pass it along, so people are aware of what's going on. And I think this is likely to move to something more formal, where there will be a paper trail where you can chime in any thoughts, you know, in some kind of PR or document. But at this stage, that's yet to exist. So unless anybody has any parting thoughts on user group structure under the Kubernetes project, I'll move on to the next agenda item. Okay, so on the agenda, I wanted to discuss a little bit about kind of a 101 on zones inside Kubernetes, just because we will have this deeper dive application of them in the presentation at KubeCon Europe, but we're only allotted 35 minutes. So if we were to do the zones 101 there, we would burn up all our runway and not have a whole lot of time to get into the meat of the presentation. But I'm going to start trying to do this, but I know a number of people on the call maybe know more than I do about these zones. So interrupt me, take it away at any time you want. I'm just going to start, and I'm going to hope that other people will join in with thoughts, opinions, knowledge on zones. But my intro, that might be too elementary for the people on this call, is just to say that, you know, Kubernetes is designed so that a single Kubernetes cluster can run across multiple failure zones. And typically in a public cloud implementation, these zones fit together with another logical grouping called a region, which is a geo region. But within a single geo region, say the United States West or something, a cloud provider might still have isolated areas that you could purchase VMs running on, implemented in such a way that they don't share common points of failure. The best practice would be to run Kubernetes spread across at least 3 availability zones. And typically in some public clouds within a region, you only have 3, but some of them might have more. And this would be where you would purchase the VMs that host your Kubernetes. If you buy a managed Kubernetes, this purchasing might automatically be being done under the covers so that you don't have to be aware of it. But if you are standing up your own, you probably are aware of it. So that's what goes on in a public cloud. On vSphere, it's actually up to you to define what constitutes zones. vSphere is far less opinionated than these public clouds, which gives you both flexibility, opportunities, but also challenges. And it's up to you to define what are these zones. It could be that for you in a big data center, a zone is effectively an aisle or a collection of aisles. But in a smaller one, it might be that you have independent racks, and these racks might have single points of failure within a rack, but redundancy across racks. So it is up to you to decide what constitutes a zone. And that we all understand that there's budget constraints. So in a public cloud, they have independent networks, independent power. For your data center, which has a finite amount of spend available, you approach this as best you can. Maybe you have independent power, but you don't have independent network. You don't have fully independent storage. So the parameters are going to be keeping your compute up, keeping your network up, maybe having shared storage that is resilient and has redundancy built in, but you may or may not have all of these. Still, it doesn't mean give up all hope. It means try to do the best you can when hosting Kubernetes on this. And how you map this to Kubernetes is zone labeling. So what can get impacted in Kubernetes is both the hosts, the cluster nodes that host Kubernetes would typically they typically have to tell Kubernetes, hey, what zone am I in? Because Kubernetes isn't going to be in a position to automatically figure this out. It could be that your distribution of Kubernetes, whatever you choose to do, would attempt to automatically label these cluster nodes as part of the install process. But if you're in there using pure upstream Kubernetes code, compiling it yourself, and then installing it yourself, that labeling would be up to you. The next step after labeling the cluster nodes is putting labels, annotations, taints, whatever, on your Kubernetes objects or resources, maybe down at the pod level or higher level assemblies of pods, so that the Kubernetes scheduler can deploy your pods in a way that maximizes resiliency. So you can do this with labels, what are called constraints that are based on topology keys and parameters like SKUs. There's also an opportunity to ask for or define affinity and anti-affinity zones, so that if you've got a modern app that has some form of resiliency in the form of clustered pods behind a load balancer, you can make requests to the scheduler to implement affinity rules or anti-affinity rules, and then these play into the zoning. So the reason I wanted to cover this is, like I say, at the upcoming KubeCon session, Michael is going to be covering techniques for monitoring changes in health of ESXi cluster nodes, as well as changes in configuration, and communicating these up into the Kubernetes layer automatically, because obviously you don't want a person making a bunch of hand edits on any kind of, well, frankly, even a home lab situation. I wouldn't want to be making hand edits to these things to accommodate those changes down at the infrastructure level if there was a better way to do it. So does anybody else have, that was my attempt at kind of a 101 on labeling and zones. Does anybody else want to try to improve upon or correct anything I dropped?
Yeah, zones are an interesting thing, especially on vSphere, I think, because I go back and forth on if it's something that's worthwhile or not. Especially since Cluster API came out and the ability to create clusters so easily, there is a lot of added complexity, especially when you manage the infrastructure yourself in doing a topology-aware Kubernetes cluster. Topology keys are not the most friendly syntax to add into Kubernetes YAMLs. That's an understatement, I think. And a lot of Helm charts you get in the community, things that exist out there, may not take topology into consideration, making using some upstream projects also difficult. On the other hand, if you do things like the VMware sources for Knative to do automatic tagging of ESXi hosts, automatic tagging of when, because all of your hosts, no matter what level you define an availability zone at in vSphere, which is either a cluster or a DRS host group, you need to tag every single ESXi host with vSphere tags so that the cloud provider interface can utilize it. So the amount of work that takes if you don't have automation in place that's consistently event-driven is very difficult to manage.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah, I think sooner or later something will go wrong, maybe horribly wrong.
Which is why what I find very interesting in this world is like KubeFed, like Kubernetes Federation, which I think is in its like 4th iteration now, and it'll probably at like the 15th or 20th iteration, it'll actually be like GA'd. But the idea of multi-clustered and having like a single API that's backed by multiple clusters and removing the complexity of topology out of Kubernetes and just having multiple small clusters and having some thin layer above that can schedule across those separate clusters is an interesting thing that the community is looking at, because even in public clouds, they're realizing that topology is a difficult thing to deal with in Kubernetes.
There's another aspect of this. Then Michael and I are still working on the deck for this presentation, and I don't know, the way it's looking now with 35 minutes, we might only have time to acknowledge that this issue exists, but not be able to demo it. But in reality, what you've often got going on in an on-prem Kubernetes installation is that the Kubernetes apps or services are interacting with legacy things that are stood up as just VMs. And not that that's even a bad model, because frankly, some of these things that might be labeled legacy, like a transactional SQL database server, really were never architected to take advantage of 3 or more nodes, and there are established proven techniques of hosting them on vSphere as VMs with resilient storage and replication, so that you just leave them where they are, but have the newer apps interact with them. And putting together the pieces so that you can schedule those Kubernetes workloads in optimal ways to deal with whatever might go on at the legacy level could have a lot of utility to people. So just throwing
Yeah.
that out there is another thing that where this whole VEBA event-driven thing could actually provide useful operational assistance as health changes or configurations change down at the infrastructure level.
It definitely can. I mean, the one difficulty, and this is the one limitation that I've talked to Michael about before also with the VEBA implementation, is that VEBA or even the VMware event sources for Knative, which is the new like version of that, I guess, kind of in the Knative world, because they're tied to a single vCenter. There are a lot of people that do topology cross vCenters. So they'll have a Kubernetes cluster that spreads multiple vCenters. That's where things get very complex because you don't have a single event stream coming into in a single event target. You need to have two event targets because you can, the event router that receives the events from vSphere is a one-to-one mapping with a vCenter. So if you have two, you need to make sure that you're syncing the two of them because the system can't do that. And that's by design, that it's to a single vCenter because otherwise you have terrible issues. But
I'm kind of curious, is that something commonly used or is that something that a few people do?
It's something that I have seen come up multiple times on the cloud provider GitHub because that was something that was not implemented originally in CPI and CSI and was in the entry. So there were people that were complaining that that wasn't in the out of tree providers. And because of that, they couldn't move to out of tree, but they wanted to use CSI, but couldn't because they needed to use the entry VCP because it only supported this. And so it came up a lot. I would say, I don't think it's a good idea, but there are people that do it.
Yeah. Another thing that would be like that of arguably in, for a common use cases, it strikes me as maybe biting off a real challenge for managing, but I suspect that you could do it, is having what I will call cloud native apps, things that can spread themselves around with, with redundancy, spread across multiple Kubernetes clusters. And I think you could do it. Whether it would be smart is another issue, but you could do it.
Listen, now that we have a lot of really good multi-cluster service meshes that can actually deal with the networking layer, that was the biggest challenge, right? The deployment in the end, we've automated, right? Continuous delivery, there are 1,000 tools that can do it for us. If we're doing GitOps, you can go with Flux, Cap Controller, Argo CD, whatever you want to use for the deployment part, and targeting one cluster or 5 clusters really isn't the challenge today, I think, because that's basically a solved issue. It's just a question of what tooling you're going to use and what little bit of glue code you're going to write. But the networking issue was always the issue, service discovery across clusters. And whether you go with commercial offerings that exist out there from Google, from VMware, from whatever, or you go with open source multi-cluster service meshes that exist as well, things that have come out of HashiCorp, different like additions on top of Istio that have come out there, which is now CNCF, EA, or other ones like Kuma, all have multi-cluster support. So really that challenge, the requirement to have a single cluster across vCenters, I think is basically going away because the main challenge that we had is going away as well, which is how do we get networking? How do we get service discovery across our applications on both vCenters? That's being solved.
That would be rather interesting because if you move it all the way up to that level to where for the app or services you're hosting, they're straddling Kubernetes clusters, then the need for those Kubernetes clusters to be ultra resilient and the infrastructure below them to be ultra resilient arguably gets reduced. And perhaps your model then is, one vCenter, one Kubernetes cluster, and the app floats across multiple Kubernetes clusters at a higher layer.
Even one vSphere cluster, one Kubernetes cluster, and don't traverse multiple vSphere clusters, right? Like you could even break it down to smaller levels. I mean, even CNIs like Antria have just introduced in the last version or the version before that multi-cluster networking. So just even without a service mesh, you can do multi-cluster networking with Antria. You can already do that with Cilium. Yes, there are complexities in setting up, obviously, the overlay networks between clusters, but it's possible to be done. And the CNIs out there that are common are adding this support. Cilium has had it for a long time. Antria just added it and is improving it constantly. I don't remember if Calico has it. But basically, the whole stack is solving this issue so that Kubernetes clusters can be as simple as possible so that you can just deploy to a single AZ. Because I think in public cloud where the AZs are taken care of, we've learned that they're a pain to deal with for the developer. So we try and take that away now. At the same point, none of this stuff is 100% ready yet, right?
Yeah.
So we do still need availability zones, but I think they're a temporary solution until these other things solidify a bit more around multi-cluster service mesh, around multi-cluster CNIs, around, how we deal with all of these things. Obviously, when you're dealing with multiple clusters, you need some higher level of management that can push down policies equally across all of the clusters. There are, again, commercial offerings and open source offerings that can do that. But you need something to manage policy, because when we look at a single cluster, so you can just push policies into that cluster. A cluster role binding gave you a cluster role binding. Now you have 7 clusters. Are you really going to create 7 cluster role bindings? Are you going to create 7 namespaces because you want to make sure the app can run in every single cluster? You add complexity there, right? So it's just a question that the complexity will never go away. The question is at what level of the stack you want the complexity to be, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, I think I've expounded what I had to say on kind of that Zones 101, and that's fascinating from Scott. It looks like, it could be a lot different a year from now. I'm not sure that the typical user would go off into that territory, but the ones that really need that resiliency and have the bigger installations, I think they would.
Yeah, and listen, I think that what was it? There was a great one from VMworld. There was a meme that came out, I think it was like 2 VMworlds ago, where it was like the CIO of a company goes to VMworld with the question of Kuber what? And he couldn't figure out what it was. And he came out saying, oh, great, I need multi-cluster service mesh with defined SLOs. Like at the end, he comes back after listening to a session on Tanzu. Right. And like, that's how he came out. Right. In the end, these changes of what was, if we looked 3 years ago at what the larger enterprises were wanting and doing in their Kubernetes environments, is now what the small little companies are doing in their Kubernetes environments. Because the big companies learn the lessons from it, the products get better, the tooling gets better, and then it slowly makes its way into the smaller companies, into the greater market. And I think that's what's happening now as well.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it's not, part of that working in is just having published materials that describe that here's how I did it. It actually worked. And, right now, you go even looking at definitions of zones and stuff inside the Kubernetes documentation, it is pretty light. Yes. I glanced at it just before this meeting for my attempt at a Zones 101. And, I found 2 or 3 pages total. And none of this was yeah, you didn't find a lot of working examples of walking you through the path of do step A, B, C, and D, and then you're there and you're done. And, you know, we did it on these 3 platforms and it worked great. And if I couldn't find that kind of thing on the first couple pages of Google search, probably no, you know, those smaller people aren't in a position to do that yet.
Exactly. So this is starting at the larger companies. They're going to do this, and then it's going to make its way into the, if it's something that catches at those levels, it'll move into the greater market, because you'll start to have blog posts out there,
Yeah.
and you're going to start to have PRs to Kubernetes IO documentation, and you're going to have all of a sudden CNCF podcasts coming out on this, and webinars, and, you know, everything.
Yeah, maybe
great.
even tooling and scripts and things that just like do it for you when you put the parameters in.
Exactly. I mean, you're going to have all of a sudden, if this becomes so big, so the CPI may be able to do certain things for you, right? Then why can't the cloud provider interface do certain things around this for you, right? If it becomes big enough, then maybe it would. Who knows, right? Like, there's all these different levels, but it's always the question of, do you put the effort, right? The engineering effort, do you put into something before you know that it's going to be adopted? But you're not going to adopt it until the engineering effort is there, until it's ready. So you have this kind of chicken and egg of,
Yeah,
the users aren't using it because it's not ready, but it's not ready because users aren't using it.
yeah, and in a way, whether you're a vendor or just managing an open source project with a mission to accomplish a new feature, ultimately you need the users to be who are willing to try it out and prove that this thing that you thought theoretically would work actually does in practice too.
Which is why I think actually with the 124 release that just came out, Kubernetes seems to be making a change on a stance on that, which is very interesting, which is, I'm not sure if people saw, but beta APIs as of 124 and forwards, beta APIs in Kubernetes, any new beta APIs will not be enabled by default in Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Till now, alpha APIs were not, and you had to enable them, but beta ones were. And now you need to enable them via feature flag as well, beta flags, which is going to be very interesting to see how many people are going to turn on those beta features, because you actually have to go in and enable them now. Right? How long was Ingress in beta? For 4 years?
Yeah. I don't know. Thanks for pointing that out. I guess I've heard that, but didn't take note of the importance and the change to that. And I'm not sure I recollect ever hearing what was the basis of that decision either.
The basis was actually, it makes sense. The issue is that beta APIs, according to the API contract of Kubernetes, are not meant for production use. The issue is that if you deploy a Kubernetes cluster, the beta APIs are there. So in your production cluster, those APIs are there. And there was an issue with that because a lot of people were reaching bugs in beta quality APIs and beta quality software that they were running in production because someone saw that there was a object and they could create an ingress, and awesome. Well, yeah, but it's beta. But it doesn't matter because it's there. And it's that overall debate that's going on, I think, overall in the CNCF. I've seen this in a lot of projects of the API versus the tool versus the code itself. Ingress was GA, but the API was beta, right? You could say that the functionality of Ingress was GA, but the API is beta or alpha or GA, and there's a separation between the two. And the issue was people were constantly having issues with beta APIs in production clusters, which shouldn't happen.
You almost
and because
wonder,
of that, they've decided to turn it off.
Yeah. You almost wonder if this maybe will or should lead to different versions of distributions. You know, I could see a world where you could have a Kubernetes distribution that gets published in what's declared the standard form of the beta APIs are hidden, and then offer another one where it is the old style of default where they're on, and you just elected which of these paths you get by which distro you install. And
Right.
somebody who publishes a distro could do it in the two forms. And
I-
maybe it simplifies things a bit rather than forcing people to just cherry pick API by API.
Yeah, and I think the difficulty with that becomes if Kubernetes is supposed to be that it runs on Kubernetes here, it should run on Kubernetes there. Once we start with deviating what that conformant Kubernetes is or what that distribution is, it becomes then very difficult to, you're going to have a lot of things of what, but it worked on my EKS cluster.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh,
I
but it
didn't
doesn't
think
work
of
on
that.
your EKS cluster, but they're the same Kubernetes version. Oh,
Mhm.
because, right, like if you
Yeah.
have to manually go and set that feature flag, you know that in the other cluster, you need to set that feature flag because you manually chose to do that. You
Yeah.
didn't just follow some blog that said, here, run this kubeadm command that happens to install the beta, channel of Kubernetes.
Yeah. Although those blogs, that's another thing I've found in the past too, that the fact that these blogs don't have some automatic sell by date and are removed from the shelf means you find these that maybe were written when a feature was in beta and it's no longer in beta, yet that isn't specifically called out, or you missed it and weren't aware of it. And it makes this whole act of trying to just get things to work on Kubernetes as a user treacherous.
Oh, yeah. The amount of examples out there that are still using older API groups of like ingress or of deployments or of things that just don't work. You get a YAML manifest in the thing. Here, do a kubectl apply to this. And you go and do that. And no, sorry, we don't have an API anymore for ingress v1 beta 1.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, what do I do?
Okay, I just noticed that in my time zone, we hit 12 noon. So last call for any parting remarks, comments, agenda items. But I think we're about at our time limit for the meeting today. And I guess I'll take that silence as no additional things. So at least for some of the people on the call, I look forward to meeting you in person at KubeCon Europe. And if I don't catch you there, we'll have another meeting in a month. So bye, everybody, and thanks for attending.
See you in 2 weeks.